They say blood is thicker than water, but I learned that greed can thin even the deepest family bonds. My identical twin brother didn't just steal my share of our family business, he stole 23 years of trust with a handshake and a lie. My name is Chen, and I'm 45 years old. Right now, I'm sitting in a small apartment that's about a quarter the size of the home I used to own, working as a freelance garden consultant for clients who have no idea that I once co-owned a $1 million landscaping company. 6 months ago, I thought I knew my twin brother better than I knew myself. We shared everything, the same face, the same dreams, and what I believed was the same moral compass. David and I started Chen Landscaping when we were 22, fresh out of college with more ambition than sense. We borrowed $5,000 from our parents, bought a beat-up pickup truck, and spent our first summer installing sprinkler systems in suburban backyards. By the time we turned 40, we employed 15 people and were designing landscapes for some of the most exclusive properties in the city. I handled the creative side, meeting with clients, designing outdoor spaces that would make them fall in love with their own backyards. David managed the operations, the numbers, the logistics that kept our dreams running smoothly. We were perfect partners, or so I thought. We trusted each other completely, which is exactly how he was able to destroy me so thoroughly. What I'm about to tell you is a story about manipulation so calculated and betrayal so complete that it took me months to even understand what had happened to me. It's about how someone who shared my DNA could look me in the eye and lie with such conviction that I questioned my own reality. But it's also about something else, about finding strength in the aftermath of devastation and discovering that sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us exactly who we really are. If stories about family, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to rebuild resonate with you, consider subscribing. I'm learning to share the truths I never thought I'd say out loud, and maybe they'll help someone else navigate their own storm. To understand how deeply David's betrayal cut, you need to understand what we built together. Being identical twins meant we were used to sharing everything. Clothes, friends, even girlfriends in high school, though never at the same time. When we decided to start a business together, it felt as natural as breathing. Our parents, who had immigrated from Taiwan in the 70s, were skeptical at first. They'd sacrificed everything to give us education and opportunities, and here we were, wanting to start a landscaping company instead of becoming doctors or engineers. But when they saw how seriously we took it, how we complemented each other's strengths, they became our biggest supporters. Those early years were magical in a way I can barely describe now. David and I would spend entire evenings spread out on my living room floor, sketching designs and running numbers, dreaming about the company we wanted to build. He had this incredible ability to see the practical side of every creative idea I had. When I'd sketch an elaborate water feature, he'd already be calculating the pump requirements and installation costs. When he'd worry about cash flow, I'd be on the phone charming another client into signing a contract. We grew slowly and deliberately. Every major decision we made together, every hire, every new service we offered, every piece of equipment we bought, it all required both of our signatures, both of our agreement. That wasn't just how we ran the business. It was how we protected our relationship. We never wanted money or success to come between us. By our mid-30s, Chen had a reputation that opened doors throughout the city. I'd walk into a consultation, and clients would already know our work from neighbors or friends. We weren't just landscapers anymore. We were artists who happened to work with living materials. David wasn't just my business partner. He was the person who made my creativity possible, who turned my visions into sustainable realities. But something started changing around our 20th year in business. It was subtle at first, David becoming more interested in the financial side, asking more questions about profit margins and operational efficiency. He'd always been the numbers person, but suddenly he was talking about market analysis and business optimization in ways that felt foreign to the partnership we'd built. The change coincided with his marriage to Jennifer, a woman he met at a business networking event. She was a corporate consultant who specialized in helping companies maximize their potential, which apparently meant finding ways to squeeze more profit out of existing operations. At first, I was happy for David. He'd been single for years, and Jennifer seemed smart and ambitious. I thought she might be good for him, but Jennifer had opinions about our business that she wasn't shy about sharing. She'd attend our company, barbecues, and make casual comments about how we could streamline operations or optimize our service offerings. She'd ask pointed questions about why we hadn't expanded into commercial properties or why we were still operating as an equal partnership instead of incorporating with a clearer hierarchy. David started echoing her language in our planning meetings. He'd talk about scaling up and maximizing efficiency in ways that made me feel like our 20-year partnership was somehow inadequate. When I'd push back, suggesting that our current approach had served us well, he'd get this look, not angry exactly, but disappointed, like I was holding us back from our potential. The most unsettling change was how he started handling the finances. David had always managed our books, but he began keeping them more to himself, claiming he was streamlining the process to save me from boring administrative work. When I'd asked to review quarterly reports or annual summaries, he'd provide them, but they became increasingly simplified, lacking the detail I was used to seeing. "You don't need to worry about all these numbers, Sarah," he'd say, sliding a single-page summary across my desk. "Focus on what you do best. The creative side is where you add the most value." At the time, I interpreted this as David being protective, maybe even considerate. I was busy with design work, and I trusted him completely. If he wanted to handle the financial complexity so I could focus on clients and creativity, that seemed like a reasonable division of labor. I had no idea he was systematically isolating me from information I'd need to protect myself. Looking back now, I can see how carefully he was setting the stage. Every conversation about the business became more technical, more focused on aspects he claimed I didn't understand. Every financial discussion became simplified to the point of meaninglessness. He was training me to defer to his expertise while simultaneously ensuring I had no way to verify what he was telling me. Our parents noticed the change too, though they interpreted it differently than I did. During family dinners, they'd comment on how business-minded David had become, how seriously he was taking his responsibilities. They saw his increased focus on finances as maturity, as him stepping up to handle the grown-up aspects of running a company. I began to feel like the creative child in our partnership, valued for my artistic contributions, but somehow less essential to the real business of making money. David never said this directly, but his attitude suggested it. When clients complimented our work, he'd graciously redirect credit to my designs. When suppliers or contractors had problems, he'd handle everything himself, claiming he didn't want to burden me with operational headaches. It was a masterful manipulation, so gradual and seemingly benevolent that I never recognized it as manipulation at all. He was positioning himself as the indispensable partner while making me feel grateful for being protected from complexity. He was teaching me to trust his judgment about money while ensuring I had no ability to form independent opinions about our financial health. By the time he was ready to make his move, I had been conditioned for months to defer to his expertise and trust his interpretation of our business situation. I had no idea that every kindness, every protection, every simplification had been designed to make me vulnerable to the lie that would destroy everything we'd built together. The call came on a Friday afternoon in late September. I was in my office, putting finishing touches on a design for a Japanese-inspired garden, when David's name appeared on my phone. His voice sounded strained, almost hollow. "Sarah, I need you to stay late tonight. We need to talk about something important." Something about the business. There was something in his tone that made my stomach drop. In 23 years of partnership, David had never sounded like that. Scared, maybe even defeated. I immediately assumed something terrible had happened. Maybe a client was suing us, or we'd made some catastrophic mistake on a major project. "What's wrong?" I asked. But he just said we'd talk when Jennifer could be there too, that he needed moral support for what he had to tell me. I spent the rest of the afternoon distracted, running through every possible scenario. By the time I walked into our conference room that evening, I had convinced myself that we were facing some kind of crisis that would require both of us to fight through together. David was already there with Jennifer, sitting across from each other at our polished oak table. The surface was covered with manila folders, calculators, and legal pads covered in Jennifer's precise handwriting. David looked like he hadn't slept in days. Jennifer looked like she was preparing for a business presentation. "Sit down, Sarah," David said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to hear." He opened the first folder and spread out what looked like months of financial documents, bank statements, profit and loss reports, accounts receivable summaries. The numbers were neatly highlighted in different colors, with handwritten notes in the margins. "The business is failing," he said simply. "We're not just losing money, we're hemorrhaging it. We've been covering operational costs with credit for the past 8 months, and we're about to hit a wall that's going to destroy everything." I stared at the papers in front of me, trying to process what he was saying. The numbers looked official, comprehensive, but they told a story that seemed impossible. According to these documents, we owed nearly $200,000 to suppliers, had 3 major clients threatening to sue us for incomplete work, and were facing bankruptcy within 60 days. "This can't be right," I said, reaching for the bank statements. "We just signed the Morrison contract last month. The Richardsons paid their final invoice 2 weeks ago. How can we be broke?" David's face crumpled with what looked like genuine anguish. "I've been trying to shield you from this, Sarah. I didn't want you to worry about the financial side while you were focused on keeping our clients happy. But the Morrison contract fell through. They're claiming our design doesn't meet city specifications. The Richardsons are disputing their final payment, saying we damaged their irrigation system." Jennifer leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Sarah, David has been carrying this burden alone for months, trying to find solutions. He's been using his personal credit to keep the company afloat, hoping things would turn around." I felt like I was drowning in information that didn't make sense. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong, but the evidence in front of me seemed overwhelming. Bank statements don't lie. Legal documents don't fabricate themselves. And David, my twin brother, my partner for 23 years, was sitting across from me with tears in his eyes, telling me that everything we'd built was about to collapse. "There has to be something we can do," I said, grasping for solutions. "We could take out a loan, restructure our debt, maybe bring in an investor." David shook his head slowly. "I've tried everything, Sarah. The banks won't extend us any more credit because of our debt-to-income ratio. No investor is going to touch a landscaping company that's already underwater. We're past the point of rescue." Jennifer pulled out another folder, this one containing what looked like legal documents. "There is one option," she said carefully. "David could buy out your share of the business for enough money to clear your personal liability and give you a fresh start. He'd take on all the debt, all the legal responsibility. You'd walk away clean. The buyout offer was $75,000 for my 50% stake in a company that, just hours earlier, I had believed was worth well over $1 million. But according to the documents in front of me, my half of the business was actually worth negative money. I would be liable for half of our debts if the company went under." "You'd be doing me a favor," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "I can't bear the thought of you losing everything because of decisions I made. This way, you get out clean, and I handle the mess." I sat there, staring at papers that made no sense, listening to my brother offer to sacrifice himself to save me from a disaster I couldn't understand. Every rational part of my mind was telling me that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation, but the emotional manipulation was perfect. David wasn't just asking me to trust him. He was positioning himself as my protector, willing to destroy his own financial future to keep me safe. "I need time to think about this," I said, but Jennifer immediately responded with urgency. "Sarah, I understand this is overwhelming, but we literally don't have time. The creditor meeting is scheduled for Monday morning. If we don't have a resolution, by then, both of you will be facing personal bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for operating while insolvent." Criminal charges. Personal bankruptcy. The words hit me like physical blows. I looked at David, my identical twin, the person I had trusted more than anyone else in the world, and saw what looked like genuine terror in his eyes. "I need you to trust me one more time," he said, sliding the buyout agreement across the table. "I know this doesn't make sense. I know it feels wrong. But I've been living with this nightmare for months, and this is the only way to protect you." The signing happened in a blur of legal language and notarized documents. I kept waiting for my instincts to kick in, for some moment of clarity that would help me understand what was really happening. But I was overwhelmed by information I couldn't verify, pressured by a timeline I couldn't control, and manipulated by emotions I couldn't separate from facts. When I walked out of that conference room, I had signed away 23 years of My life for $75,000 and a promise that my brother was sacrificing himself to save me. I drove home in a daze, feeling like I had just escaped disaster, but also like I had lost everything that mattered to me. It would be weeks before I understood that the disaster was David himself, and the only thing I had escaped was the ability to protect myself from what he had planned. The first few days after signing the buyout agreement felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's life. I'd wake up expecting to go to work, then remember that Chen landscaping was no longer my concern. I'd check my email out of habit, then remember that I no longer had access to our company accounts. The rhythm of 23 years had been broken overnight, and I had no idea how to fill the empty space it left behind. David had promised to stay in touch, to let me know how he was managing the crisis, but his communication stopped almost immediately. When I called his cell phone, it went straight to voicemail. When I stopped by the office, I was told he was out meeting with creditors or lawyers, always dealing with some urgent aspect of our company's collapse. The $75,000 felt like a fortune and nothing at all simultaneously. It was more money than I'd ever had in my personal savings account, but it also represented everything I'd worked for since I was 22 years old. I deposited the check into my personal account and watched the number appear on my bank statement, trying to make sense of how 2 decades of partnership could be reduced to such a relatively small sum. Within the first month, reality began to set in. I had to find a new apartment because the lease on my house was in the company's name, and David claimed he couldn't maintain it while dealing with our debt crisis. I had to buy a car because my BMW was technically a company vehicle. I had to figure out health insurance, business insurance, and a dozen other practical details that David had always handled. The isolation was almost worse than the financial uncertainty. Chen had been more than just our business. It had been our social world. Company barbecues, industry events, relationships with suppliers and contractors, all of that disappeared overnight. I found myself with no professional identity and very few personal relationships that existed outside. The context of our partnership. Former employees started calling, asking questions I couldn't answer. Why had I abandoned the company? Why wasn't I returning calls? Some of them had heard rumors about financial trouble, but they wanted to know what was really happening, what it meant for their own job security. I found myself in the bizarre position of trying to explain a situation I didn't fully understand myself. David is handling everything, I'd tell them, which felt both true and completely inadequate. I'm sure he'll be in touch soon about what's happening with everyone's positions, but David wasn't in touch with anyone, as far as I could tell. The company phone went unanswered. The office building looked abandoned whenever I drove past. It was as if Chen landscaping had simply vanished, taking with it not just my livelihood but my entire sense of identity. I started seeing a therapist, partly because I was struggling with depression, and partly because I needed someone to help me make sense of what had happened. Dr. Martinez was a patient woman in her 50s who specialized in major life transitions, and she helped me begin to untangle the emotional complexity of losing a business partnership that was also a family relationship. You're grieving multiple losses simultaneously, she told me during one of our early sessions. You've lost your career, your financial security, your business partnership, and your relationship with your brother. That's an enormous amount of change to process. But even Dr. Martinez couldn't help me understand why nothing about the situation felt right. Why had David become so secretive about company finances in the months leading up to the crisis? Why had the crisis seemed to appear overnight when our client relationships had seemed strong? Why was Jennifer so prepared with legal solutions when I hadn't even known there was a problem? I tried to push these questions aside, telling myself that I was just struggling to accept a painful reality. David had always been the financial expert, and I had chosen to focus on the creative aspects of our business. Maybe I had been naive about our actual financial situation. Maybe my artistic temperament had blinded me to practical problems that David had been trying to solve alone. But the questions kept nagging at me, especially during the long nights when I couldn't sleep. I'd lie in my small apartment, staring at the ceiling, running through conversations and memories, trying to identify when things had started to go wrong. The more I thought about it, the less sense any of it made. 3 months after signing the buyout agreement, I ran into Maria Santos, who had been our head of operations for 5 years before leaving to start her own landscaping company. She was, coming out of a coffee shop in the part of town where our office was located, and she stopped to talk when she saw me. "Sarah, I've been wondering what happened to you," she said, her voice concerned. "I heard rumors that Chen was having problems, but the company seems to be doing great. I've seen the crews out on several major projects just this month." I stared at her, feeling like she was speaking a foreign language. "What do you mean the company seems to be doing great?" "Well, I've seen your trucks around town, and I heard through the grapevine that David landed that huge commercial contract with the new shopping center development. I just assumed you were keeping a low profile while you focused on the big projects." The key. Shopping center development. I knew exactly what she was talking about. It was a contract we'd been pursuing for over a year, worth more than $300,000 in revenue. According to David, we'd lost that contract because of our financial problems. "Maria," I said carefully, "when did you hear about David getting that contract?" "Maybe 6 weeks ago? I ran into Jimmy Rodriguez at the supply house, and he mentioned that Chen had crews working on the initial site preparation." 6 weeks ago. That was just 2 weeks after I'd signed the buyout agreement, after David had told me the company was bankrupt and facing immediate collapse. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table staring at my laptop screen. For the first time since signing the agreement, I allowed myself to really examine what had happened. I pulled up our old company website, which I expected to find defunct or filled with notices about business closure. Instead, I found a thriving business with updated project galleries, new staff listings, and a prominent announcement about Chen's expansion into commercial landscaping services. The website featured recent photos of projects I didn't recognize, all completed under our company name, but without any input from me. That's when I finally understood what had really happened. David hadn't saved me from disaster. He had created a fictional disaster to steal my half of a successful business. Every document he'd shown me, every crisis he'd described, every urgent deadline that had pressured me into signing. It had all been carefully orchestrated to manipulate me into giving away everything I'd worked for. The betrayal was so complete, so expertly planned, that I spent the rest of that night alternating between rage and disbelief. This wasn't a business partnership that had gone wrong. This wasn't even ordinary greed. This was a calculated destruction of trust that had taken months to set up and required my own brother to look me in the eye and lie with conviction I never imagined he possessed. I had been systematically isolated, manipulated, and defrauded by the person I trusted most in the world. And the worst part was that he had done it all while positioning himself as my protector, making me grateful for my own destruction. The morning after discovering David's deception, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The depression that had been weighing me down since signing the buyout agreement had transformed into something much more focused and purposeful. I wasn't just sad anymore. I was angry, and for the first time in my adult life, I was angry at my twin brother. But I also felt something else: relief. The nagging feeling that nothing about our business crisis had made sense was finally explained. I wasn't losing my mind or failing to understand basic business principles. I had been the victim of an elaborate fraud, which meant the situation wasn't hopeless. If David had lied to steal my share of the business, then there had to be a way to prove it and get back what was rightfully mine. My first call was to Patricia Hendricks, a lawyer who specialized in business disputes. I'd met her at a networking event years earlier, and I remembered her as someone who was both sharp and ethical. When I explained my situation over the phone, she agreed to meet with me that afternoon. Patricia's office was in a downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every type of business story imaginable. I spread out all the documents from the buyout meeting across her conference table and told her everything I could remember about that night. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers David had shown me. "Sarah," she said finally, "these financial documents are either completely fabricated or they're from a different company entirely. The bank account numbers don't match the format used by any local banks, and some of these supplier invoices are for services that don't exist." She pulled out her laptop and spent several minutes researching public records. According to the Secretary of State's office, Chen Landscaping is in good standing, with no liens, no bankruptcy filings, and no legal judgments against it. Your brother has been filing quarterly reports showing consistent profitability. The evidence was even more damning than I had expected. David hadn't just manipulated financial records, he had created an entirely fictional version of our company's situation. The criminal charges he'd threatened, the creditor meetings, the urgent timeline, none of it had been real. "What are my options?" I asked. Patricia leaned back in her chair, her expression serious. "Legally, you have several options. This is clearly fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and probably criminal conversion. You could file civil suits to recover your ownership stake, plus damages, and you could also file criminal complaints." She paused, studying my face. "But I need to ask you something important. What outcome do you actually want here? Do you want to destroy your brother and recover as much money as possible? Or do you want to get back what's yours while preserving the possibility of some kind of family relationship?" It was a question I hadn't fully considered. My first instinct was to pursue every legal remedy available to make David pay for what he'd done. But Patricia was right to ask about my ultimate goals. Did I want justice, or did I want revenge? Did I want to recover my business, or did I want to punish my brother? "I want my business back," I said finally. "I want to be treated as an equal partner in something I helped build. But I also want David to understand that what he did was wrong, and I want assurance that he can never do anything like this again." Patricia nodded approvingly. "Then we need to be strategic about this. If we come out with all guns blazing, David will lawyer up immediately, and this becomes a protracted, expensive battle that could destroy the business you're trying to recover. But if we're smart about how we approach it, we might be able to resolve this more quietly." Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia and I developed a comprehensive strategy. First, we gathered evidence. I reconnected with former employees who were willing to provide statements about the company's actual financial health during the time David claimed we were failing. We obtained copies of contracts and invoices that proved the business had been thriving when David told me it was collapsing. Most importantly, we discovered that David had been planning the buyout for months before our crisis meeting. Jennifer's consulting company had been paid $15,000 by Chen for business restructuring analysis starting in June, 3 months before David claimed to discover our financial problems. The paper trail was devastating. David had paid his wife's company to help him figure out how to steal my share of the business, then used company funds to finance the fraud that would make it possible. But Patricia advised against confronting David directly or filing immediate legal actions. "Right now, he thinks he got away with it," she said. "He's comfortable, maybe even confident. People make mistakes when they're comfortable. Let's see what other evidence we can gather while he's not being careful." I spent those weeks rebuilding my professional network and learning everything I could about business fraud and partnership law. I also started seeing Dr. Martinez twice a week, working through the emotional complexity of planning to confront my own brother with evidence of his betrayal. It's important that you approach this from a position of strength, not victimhood. Dr. Martinez told me during one session, "You're not asking David for forgiveness or understanding. You're presenting him with facts and demanding justice." The hardest part was maintaining normal family relationships while knowing what I knew. David had started returning my calls, probably because enough time had passed that he felt safe. He'd ask how I was adjusting to my new life, whether I needed any help managing my finances. The concern in his voice sounded genuine, which made his deception even more disturbing. "I'm doing fine," I'd tell him, fighting to keep my voice neutral. "Just taking some time to figure out what comes next." Our parents had started asking questions about why I wasn't involved with the company anymore, why David was running everything alone. I deflected their concerns as best I could, telling them it was a mutual decision, that we'd decided to pursue different directions. But I knew that conversation was coming too. David's fraud hadn't just affected me. It had the potential to destroy our entire family's relationships. Our parents had spent their lives being proud of what their children had built together. Learning that one of their sons had systematically defrauded the other would devastate them. By the end of October, Patricia and I had assembled a comprehensive case file. Bank records, employee statements, contract documents, email records, and a timeline that clearly showed David's months of preparation for the buyout. We had enough evidence to prove fraud in both civil and criminal court. "Are you ready for this?" Patricia asked during our final preparation meeting. "Once we confront David with this evidence, there's no going back. Your relationship with your brother will never be the same, regardless of how this resolves. I thought about the person David had been when we started Chen and Chen together. The brother who had stayed up all night helping me perfect our first major design proposal. I thought about the person he had become, capable of looking me in the eye and lying with such conviction that I'd questioned my own sanity. He made his choice when he decided to defraud me, I said. Now I'm making mine. The confrontation was scheduled for the following Monday at our parents' house, with both of them present. Patricia had advised that family witnesses would put additional pressure on David to resolve things quietly, without legal battles that would become public record. I spent the weekend going through old photos of David and me, pictures from our childhood and early business days. In every single image, we looked happy together, like two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. It was hard to reconcile those pictures with what I now knew about my brother's capacity for deception. But by Sunday night, I was ready. I had spent months being the victim of David's manipulation. Starting Monday, I was going to be the architect of his accountability. I arrived at my parents' house early Monday evening, carrying a briefcase that contained 4 months of investigation into my brother's betrayal. My mother had prepared dinner, as she always did for family meetings, but I knew that none of us would have much appetite for food once this conversation began. David and Jennifer arrived precisely on time, which somehow didn't surprise me. David looked relaxed, even cheerful, like a man who had successfully navigated a difficult period and was ready to move forward. Jennifer carried herself with the same confident professionalism she'd displayed during our buyout meeting. My parents, Thomas and Linda Chen, sat at the head of their dining room table, looking concerned but hopeful. They had no idea why I'd asked for this family meeting, but they'd agreed because they could sense the tension that had been building between David and me over the past several months. Before we eat, I said, settling into my chair across from David, I need to share some information about what really happened with Chen and Chen Landscaping. David's expression immediately shifted, a flicker of wariness crossing his face. Sarah, I thought we had resolved all of that. You seemed comfortable with the buyout arrangement. I was comfortable with it, I replied calmly, because I believed you were telling me the truth about our company's financial situation. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the first folder. But it turns out that everything you told me about our business failing was a lie. The silence in the room was profound. My parents looked confused, glancing between David and me as if we were speaking in code. Jennifer's face had gone very still, the professional mask she wore so well. Sarah, David said carefully, I know, this has been a difficult transition for you, but accusing me of lying isn't going to help anyone move forward. I placed the first set of documents on the table, bank statements showing Chen and Chen's actual financial position during the months. David claimed we were failing. These are our real bank records, David, not the fabricated ones you showed me in October. David reached for the papers, his hands not quite steady. I don't understand what you're trying to prove here. I'm proving that you committed fraud, I said simply. Our company wasn't failing. We weren't facing bankruptcy. You created fake financial documents to manipulate me into selling you my share of a profitable business for a fraction of what it was worth. My father leaned forward, his voice sharp with concern. What is she talking about, David? But David wasn't looking at our parents anymore. His attention was focused entirely on the documents in front of him, his face growing pale as he recognized the implications of what I had discovered. I pulled out the second folder. Here are statements from our employees, confirming that the company was taking on new clients and completing major projects during the exact time period you told me we were hemorrhaging money. Jennifer finally spoke, her voice carefully controlled. Sarah, you're clearly upset about how things worked out, but making accusations isn't going to change the legal agreement you signed. You're right, I said, pulling out the third folder. The legal agreement I signed can't be changed, but it can be voided, because it was obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation. This folder contained the most damaging evidence. Records, showing that Jennifer's consulting company had been paid by Chen and Chen to develop the restructuring plan that became my buyout, months before David claimed to discover our financial crisis. You paid your wife to help you figure out how to steal my half of the business, I said, looking directly at David. Then you used company money to finance the fraud. My mother made a small sound, almost like a gasp. My father sat back in his chair, his face a mixture of confusion and growing anger. David was staring at the documents, and I could see him trying to calculate his options. Deny everything and hope I couldn't prove it? Admit to some lesser version of what had happened? Try to justify his actions somehow? It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. My parents looked stunned, as if they couldn't quite process what their son had just confessed to. How was it supposed to happen, David? I asked. He looked up at me, and for the first time in months, I saw something that looked like the brother I'd grown up with, vulnerable, confused, maybe even ashamed. Jennifer thought we could expand the business faster if we had clearer decision-making authority, he said. She said equal partnerships were inefficient, that successful companies needed hierarchy. So you decided to eliminate me instead of talking to me about restructuring our partnership? We tried to figure out other ways, Jennifer interjected, but I cut her off. No, Jennifer. You tried to figure out how to steal my business without facing legal consequences. There's a difference. I pulled out the final folder, Patricia's legal analysis and recommended remedies. Here's what's going to happen now. You have two choices, David. We can resolve this privately, or we can resolve this in court. I spread out Patricia's summary across the table. Option 1. You immediately restore my full ownership stake in Chen, plus compensation for the financial and emotional damages I've suffered. We restructure the partnership with independent oversight and transparent financial management. David was scanning the legal documents, his face growing more pale with each page. Option 2. I file civil and criminal complaints for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conversion. The case becomes public record, which means everyone in our industry learns that Chen Landscaping was built on defrauding one of its founders. The business you were trying,